I'm going to be talking to Professor Kristen van de Biezenbos, who from the California Western School of Law, about Donald Trump's national security strategy that was released last week, the implications for Canada, and they are quite profound, actually, especially around energy. So welcome to the interview, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Mark, and I'm happy to be here.
You and I have had a number of conversations around this topic, but the strategy last week was new. It reintroduced a 200-year-old idea, the Monroe Doctrine. Maybe you could just give my audience a brief overview of what the strategy is intended to do and what the Monroe Doctrine is.
Sure. So every president releases at some point during his presidency, usually towards the beginning, a national security strategy for his administration for at least the next year. And the Trump administration has released theirs fairly late. Most of his national security plan refers to rethinking the relationship between the US and Europe, but there is a section about the Western Hemisphere, which he refers to as his Monroe Doctrine. So James Monroe, when he was president of the United States, released a national security strategy that reasserted the right of countries like the United States and Canada to determine their own destinies and insisted that Europeans had no colonial rights left in the Western Hemisphere. So he was essentially saying to Europe, butt out. We are our own countries now, and you need to leave. And so I think with the Trump strategy, specifically calling it the Monroe Doctrine, I think is trying to signal something very specific.
But there's a key part of the Monroe Doctrine that is germane to our conversation. Over the years, I mean, decades, literally, the Monroe Doctrine became something more. It started out as Europe, but out of the Americas, and then it became, as the U.S. grew in terms of economic prominence and political prominence and its geopolitical influence, it began to see it as the hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere. And for instance, it treated Latin America like its backyard. And
Yes.
Canada was its front yard, which was kind of just taken for granted because we were compliant and we basically got, we were happy to sell our resources to the United States. Now we've seen Prime Minister Mark Carney say that integration, further integration is done. We're done. We're going to turn to Asia, turn to Europe. And I see his reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine as a warning to Canada. Don't step out of line. Otherwise, we will assert our authority to get you back in line so that you are focused on providing your resources to the United States.
I would agree with that, and I might take it one step further and say whether you step out of line or not, the U.S. will do what it has to do to secure the natural resources that it sees as kind of its the Trump, I think, envisions all of the natural resources of the Western Hemisphere as first and foremost belonging to the United States, wherever they're located.
Yes, I would agree with that. And of course, he sees the rise. Part of this is in response to the rise of China as the next superpower. And very clearly, and this gets into his seizure of the Venezuelan oil tankers. He seized one. Now he's promised that he's going to seize more. And there's a division between the two, whereas Trump says we are going to use energy dominance in oil and gas. So it's basically oil exports and LNG, and the U.S. is the biggest producer in the world of both of those. And then China has said, no, we're a major importer. We're going to electrify. We're now the biggest electro state in the world. And Trump is making darn sure that anybody within the Western Hemisphere, like Venezuela, that steps out of line, he's going to claim that oil as his own and think that he has a legal right to it. And I see it all as part of that Monroe Doctrine approach.
I think that's right. I mean, from his perspective, he's really focused on this idea of returning manufacturing, sort of a reindustrialization of the US, because, of course, the US and many countries have outsourced a lot of their manufacturing to Asia, including China. So he wants to return that to the United States. And as part of that overall strategy, I think what he's imagining is that when we also need to secure supply chains for critical minerals and other natural resources, that we're going to do whatever we have to do to secure them wherever they are, again. And in particular, I think he also imagines that countries like Canada and Venezuela should be grateful to the United States for essentially propping up their economies by buying their natural resources. And so in a sense, it's like they're owed to us, right? Like you should offer as tribute all of your natural resources to the United States.
There's another framework here. So we've got the national security strategy, which sets out a kind of a new approach for the Trump administration. We've got the reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says that the United States is the 800-pound gorilla in the Western Hemisphere, and it will exercise that power. But there's another idea that was developed in Canada 100 years ago by academics like Harold Adams Innes, the Staples Thesis. And this is a way of understanding Canada's economic history, where we have developed through a succession of natural resource extraction. So it started with fish, and then it was furs, and then it was timber, and then it was minerals, and then it was oil, and then it was gas, and then it was grains. All of those together, the development of those over time is the basis for the Canadian economy. And of late, the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years, 60 years, it's been almost exclusively north-south. We trade with the Americans, send them our natural resources, and they send back manufactured goods. Within the Staples thesis, that's referred to as the metropolis hinterland relationship. So you call it, a vassal state, whatever, but Canada is essentially, and I think this is the way Trump views us, we are the hinterland. Our job is to provide the raw materials for the U.S. industrial machine. The gorilla, and we should just be thankful. And he will do whatever's necessary in order to keep us in line.
I think that's right. Yes. And I would also say that if you look at Project 2025, I don't know that. So, from Trump's perspective, I suspect that this is purely a kind of economic exchange. He really sees the US as this enormous wealth producing engine, and that Canada should be happy to take part in that by selling all of its natural resources to us in exchange for money. And so, for him, he doesn't really see why Canada would have any kind of problem with that. But from Project 2025, I think it's also important to understand that there's some people in the Trump administration who really believe that the United States, and only the United States, has almost a divine right to rule. And so within its sphere of influence, it's almost more of a moral imperative. Like countries like Canada must give their natural resources to the United States because the United States has been like divinely mandated to guide the rest of the world on the correct path. So it's you have both of those forces at work, where on the one hand there's sort of that cold hard calculus, which is that we've got all the money, and if you want some of our money, send us all of your goods. Corner the supply chains. Like, we want Canada to essentially be like one of the countries in Africa, for example, or that China has managed to create a kind of dependence relationship through loans and through economic support in exchange for critical minerals and other natural resources. He imagines doing the same thing, only we don't actually lend anybody any money. We'll just pay you for it. But I think it's also important to understand that there's no sense of this is two equally, it's not two peers speaking with each other and trading with each other. Here's the United States on the top of its shining hill, and everybody else is at the bottom.
You mentioned the Shining Hill, and that actually has a lot of relevance in American political history, because going back to the Puritans, there was this mythology that the United States was formed as the beacon on the hill, the shining city on the hill, that the democracy, the republic it had a moral right to assert its authority, because it had the moral authority that came with being a Christian nation.
Yes.
They unsullied by all of the politics and the religious strife that came out of Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And America was above that. It was pure. And therefore it was an example to the rest of the hemisphere. All of that is still a part of American political mythology, isn't it?
It is, and in particular, people who are in the Trump administration now, they really believe this. And from their perspective, this is part of the anti-democratic movement in the United States right now, right? This is part of the undoing of many of the levers of American government that provide accountability and checks on power. Because fundamentally, if you believe that the United States has a divine mandate, then anything, including the will of the American people or the Canadian people, that runs counter to that needs to be crushed. So it's part of the anti-democratic movement in the GOP today, in the MAGA movement. And if those people don't care about the will of the American people, they certainly don't care about the will of the Canadian people or the Venezuelan people.
Now, there's an interesting wrinkle on this from the Canadian side because the premier who's closest to the MAGA culture, which is Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and
Mm-hmm.
her United Conservative Party, they have been calling for a pipeline to the West Coast, the second one, because of course we have Trans Mountain expansion. So they want to tap Asian and European markets, supposedly. This actually runs counter to the Monroe Doctrine and the national security strategy that Trump is promoting, and the energy dominance doctrine that he's promoting. And so, how do we square this? His acolyte, if we will, trying to go against him by seeking markets that are not American.
I would explain that I don't actually think it's as incongruous as it appears, because I do agree that Danielle Smith is very sympathetic to Trump and the MAGA movement. But she isn't, I think she sort of sees herself as a kind of Trumpian figure who's trying to stand up for these sort of inherently good things like free markets, like oil wealth, like, natural resources, the exploitation of natural resources to the benefit of Alberta. So from her perspective, it's not that she needs to be a partner of Trump, it's that she's the Trump of Alberta. So she will do for Alberta what she has to do. Sort of, she doesn't see necessarily Alberta as part of Canada, it's Alberta in spite of Canada. So it's more of that sense that, like America, Alberta is also the voice of reason within Canada, but is being ignored. So she stands up for that voice of reason. She stands up for Alberta.
That's a very interesting way to put it. And I have to say that it is perfectly consistent with what the Canadian oil and gas industry has been advocating for a long time. And for them, it's dollars and cents because selling all of its product down into the U.S., it has been subject to what's called the discount, right?
Right.
There's
That's right.
there's the West Texas intermediate price, and then there's the Western Canadian select price.
Mhm.
And there's quite a gap between them, usually about, I think the average is $12 per barrel. That's a lot of money.
Yes.
And it's affected by things like demand in the U.S., pipeline capacity. Sometimes the pipeline will go down and it backs up into supply into Alberta, and then prices that gap widens. And so the Canadian industry has argued for a long time that it needs pipelines to the West Coast, so it has what it calls optionality. It can sell
Yes.
to the US when it wants, it can sell more to Asia when it wants, and that gets it the best price. And Danielle Smith is nothing if she is not the mouthpiece of that industry.
That's right. I mean, that part of that, and for your listeners, just a little point of additional context so they understand why there is that discount. It's because the oil from the oil sands is heavy oil, so it requires additional refining in order to turn it into usable products like gasoline, and that's why it trades at a discount. It's disfavored by people who buy oil because the lighter the grade of crude, and most of the crude that comes from Texas, for example, is light sweet crude. The lighter it is, the cheaper it is to refine into valuable products. So Canadian oil needs to be refined more in order to make it marketable. And the only refineries in North America that can even do that are in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. There's 5 million barrels a day of refining capacity in the US, 70
Mhm.
that can handle heavy crude. 70% of that was designed specifically for Alberta heavy.
That's
And
right.
that's and this is a point that's often lost on Canadians. They say, "Oh my God, we don't have any leverage over the US." Oh, yes, we do, because those refineries absolutely are designed for and require that Alberta heavy crude. Without it, they cannot switch to light crude. And that
Right.
gives, and I don't think Trump, I don't know if he understands that who has leverage here, but you know what? One thing he does, he's made his career on finding weak points where he has leverage and exploiting them. And so, and I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it seems like Canada and Alberta do understand leverage, and they are trying to increase theirs by building these pipelines to the West Coast.
Yes, that's right. And remember too, I think that Danielle Smith, UCP, and in general, it's part of that kind of Western alienation narrative. But Alberta really feels that it has contributed so much natural resources wealth to Canada, and that it just doesn't get, it just can't get no respect, right? So it's contributed all this money. It's a very sort of um, I don't want to say necessarily victim mentality, but it's this kind of sense of like nobody cares about all the work that we've done for you. And that sort of sense of grievance is really one of the things that animates Danielle Smith's UCP and also Trump's GOP.
So let's back up for a minute, Krista. We've talked about the Monroe Doctrine, the national security strategy. That's one frame within which to understand this relationship. Then we've talked about the Staples Thesis and essentially Trump wanting to reassert that old dynamic where, Canada's the hinterland, the United States is the metropolis, and, resources flow one way, manufactured goods flow the other way. Uh, but now there's this other dynamic, and I want to frame it this way. If you look at the amount of oil and gas that Canada produces, we are the fourth largest in the world, and behind the U.S., Russia, and Saudi Arabia, and it's all headquartered out of Alberta. So you may as well say Alberta is the fourth largest. We're the fifth largest gas producer in the
Mhm.
world, and but the other three all have access to
LNG
tidewater,
terminals? Yeah,
to tidewater, right to a coast.
right.
They
Oh,
don't have to
yes.
go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
Texas doesn't have to go through New Mexico or Louisiana to get to a coast. It's got one right there.
Yeah.
And Alberta is the only one that has to ask other jurisdictions, subnational jurisdictions, for permission or agreement to get a pipeline to get its product to market. It really resents that. It really does. And
Yeah.
it looks at the oil sands and says, we have the third largest oil resource in the world. We can produce it cheaper than anybody else. And this is why Danielle Smith says we want to double oil production from 4 million barrels a day to 8 million barrels a day, because she and the industry want to be the equivalent to Russia and Saudi Arabia. And they are frustrated because, British Columbia doesn't want to give them a pipeline. And the Trudeau government didn't want to, always was putting regulations and that impeded their ability to increase supply. And I think that frustration, it has a lot to do with why Danielle Smith uh, uh, has this grievance culture and is complaining all the time. She's reflecting the frustration she's seeing within the industry and within the Alberta business community.
I think that's right. And I think that in general, there is also a sort of sense. I mean, you talk about LNG. There is, of course, an LNG terminal in British Columbia, but it only exports British Columbia gas. And so that's a frustration for Alberta too, right? I mean, to a certain extent, there's the Alberta and British Columbia natural gas industry is actually intimately connected by a single a single gas pipeline network that goes through both provinces. So it's interesting because gas in some ways is a success story for British Columbia and Alberta, although it's not really so. I think this is again one of those things where culturally speaking, Alberta also feels sort of punished by the rest of the country because of its reliance on oil and particularly heavy oil, which is extremely carbon intensive. And then you also have like British Columbia, which makes quite a lot of money off of gas and some money off of oil too, but somehow is spared the kind of disdain of the other provinces, even though it has that natural resource wealth and it does use it. And so I think that just sort of contributes. I mean, some of it is not wrong, right? Some of it is, it is true that there is a tendency, especially from people like me in the climate movement, to speak about people whose livelihood depends on fossil fuels in ways that are morally chastising, and that is never going to be a good way to get people on side.
Right. So the purpose of this interview was to try to come up with a framework within which to help our audience understand these various trends that are taking place. So the first one is the national security strategy and the Monroe Doctrine. The second is the Staples Thesis, which is what Trump wants to reestablish in a big way between Canada and the U.S. And the third is this idea that Alberta's grievance culture comes out of the frustration of being constrained as a subnational government that is landlocked and can't get its infrastructure to tidewater whether it's in Manitoba or whether it's in British Columbia. And that then leads to this, Danielle Smith strategy. And I think those three frames together go a long way to helping folks understand the kind of politics we're seeing and in Trump's case, his geopolitics.
I think that's right. And I also would just add one little addendum, which is that um, I'm not sure to what degree this is still true, but it's worth remembering that more than any other province, Alberta has been somewhat Americanized because the oil industry there was started by Americans. So they brought with them a kind of um, profit is king. It's a very sort of, American capitalist greed is good, which, whether that's, we're certainly, greed is good revitalization right now with Trump, sort of the ultimate deal maker as he sort of sees himself. And I think Alberta is really some parts of the Alberta UCP, and the oil industry in Alberta too is receptive to that because it's some of the culture there is actually built on a very American view of the sort of inherent goodness of profit.
Let's add that as a fourth frame here because it's not just the oil industry. 120 years ago, when there was the national policy and Canada was encouraging immigration, a lot of American farmers moved up and homesteaded in
That's
Alberta.
true. Yeah.
And a number of religious groups like Mormons moved into Alberta in a big way,
Yeah.
and that they're very influential today in Alberta politics. And then there has been over the years the deep, deep, deep connections between the evangelical Christian social conservatives in Alberta and their American counterparts. And on top of that, very deep connections between the Republican Party activists, like their operatives, the folks who do the kind of training. They come up to Alberta and train Alberta political operatives on GOP ideas. So that Americanization of Alberta, which it doesn't, there's no equivalent in any other province, is another frame within which to understand the events or the stories that we're talking about.
Right. And I would stress that most Albertans are proudly Canadian, but there is a kind of built-in sympathy to a lot of these kind of right-wing American ideas because of that sort of, yeah, there's an active flow of American ideas and American political trends going into Alberta in a way that is not true for the other provinces.
And I want to add one point here in that as a journalist, I've had the opportunity energy media is now in its 18th year. We started in Calgary, and I've had it, I've talked to a lot of these people off the record and been part of conversations off the record. And I would have to say that the oil and gas senior management in Alberta, in Calgary in particular, and it's not just the oil companies. We're talking about the service sector. We're talking about the business community. Hold deeply, deeply conservative and now libertarian views about how politics works, how society works, the role of markets, those sorts of things would be there. They would be very much at home in Houston as much as they are in Calgary. And we don't see that reflected as much in the media or in public comments, but I can tell you behind the scenes that intellectual and spiritual connection with Texas in particular is very influential.
I mean, and I think when we think about somebody like Danielle Smith, she looks at somebody like Trump, who has basically given people like her permission to really come out and say the quiet part out loud when it comes to a lot of these, what I think a lot of Canadians would consider to be sort of fringe American right-wing social positions. I mean, they're in many parts of the US, they're mainstream. And so they've been to some extent mainstreamed in Alberta in a way they haven't been in other provinces.
That's very true. And as we draw the interview to a close, I want to point out to folks the reason you speak so knowledgeably about Alberta is because when I first started interviewing you, you were teaching at the University of Calgary.
Mhm.
So you do have those connections.
Yes, I taught there for 6 years, and I still actively work with Canadian scholars and academics and business people in the energy world. So I keep track of what's going on there.
Well, Kristen, this is we've had several interviews about this, and I'll if I can remember, I'll try to put links to them in the video description here. But we this is we're going to have more of these because this what Donald Trump is doing around the national security strategy, around the Monroe Doctrine. This is not the end of it. This is the beginning. So thank you very much for this.
Yes, you're welcome.